Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. In this episode, we're talking about how we know what we know about bird migration. Our guest, Rebecca Heisman, describes herself on her website as a bird writer for hire. Her first book, Flight Path, has the following subtitle: How a passionate and quirky group of pioneering scientists solved the mystery of bird migration. So this episode is as much about people as it is about birds. And we'll link to Rebecca's book in the show notes section, which would be right underneath. Rebecca, thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
For those who haven't read it since it's just out, can you outline your book, the broad thesis of it?
Yeah, it's essentially the story of the history and science behind bird migration research. There's a lot of really wild and surprising stories in the history of how scientists figured out how bird migration works, and the book just takes you through all the different ways that scientists have studied migration, from bird banding up to high-tech things like genetic analysis, and how each one works and who the people are behind it.
So you've mentioned bird banding, and I know that was in the first part of your book. I've never done it. So tell us about this bird banding and bird migration.
Yeah, so bird banding, or bird ringing as it's called in some parts of the world, you essentially set up nets to catch birds as they fly into them. And then once you have the bird, you put a little metal bracelet around its ankle. And each one of these has an individual number on it that sets it apart from all the other ones. And then if the bird is recaptured later, or if it dies and someone finds it and they find the band, they can report the band number and we can figure out something about that bird's movements.
Do you think is this an early approach, or is it still used, and how successful is it?
Oh, it's definitely still used. And in North America, it got its start around the beginning of the 20th century as a sort of a systematic thing. And it's still done there. I was just at a bird banding conference a couple of weeks ago, and the data from it has been really useful. I mentioned that if a bird is recaptured, we can tell something about where it's been. But in a lot of cases, we don't even need recaptures for the data to be useful, because these bird observatories, as they're called, that have been doing this for a very long time, they just have records of like on what date each year do certain species pass through the bird observatory and get captured. And so it's let us see things like how the timing of migration has shifted earlier in spring over time due to climate change and things like that, because it's this amazing long-term data set.
Yeah. And then you talk about flight call recordings as a way to track bird migration as well in your book.
Yes, so a lot of birds, especially songbirds, migrate at night. And when they do this, many species make these unique calls called nocturnal flight calls that they don't necessarily make at other times, but are unique to different species. And so one way that some people study migration is you can put out automated microphones that can pick up and record the calls of these birds passing overhead. And then you can get a sense of, again, what species were passing over on certain nights and roughly how many there were. Although obviously one weakness of it is that you don't get any information about birds that aren't calling. So you have to keep that in mind, that there could be some quiet birds up there too.
One of our earlier guests, Scott Weidensall, who has written blurb for your book, also was saying if only people
Yes.
knew what was going on in the night sky,
Yeah.
how many birds are migrating at night and everything. So the weakness of using bird calls for tracking migration is that you lose out a whole data set of birds that don't call. What is the strength of it? Is the ease of it, that you can record and find out where they are when they are?
Yeah, I would say so. And it does tell us something about sort of these large scale bird migration patterns, where you can just see like on what nights where there are lots of migrants passing over, on what nights where there are not so many migrants passing over. You might pick up species that you say wouldn't get in a net for bird banding. So you'll have some data about species that you might miss otherwise. It can be very time consuming to analyze this data, because researchers in the past have had to just listen to hours and hours of recordings to listen for these calls and try and figure out what they are. But now they're developing some computerized tools to help with that part.
Uh-huh. And then you earlier mentioned radar, and you have this great section where you explain for a non-engineer how radar is used to track birds. So can you explain to us?
Yeah, so radar is just a special way of using radio waves. So you have special equipment that sends out radio waves. They bounce off objects in their path, and some of the energy from those radio waves comes back to a detector that's part of the radar equipment. So for anyone who's familiar with sonar or echolocation, where you're using sound waves, it's basically like that, but using radio to figure out what's out there. And it was first developed for detecting planes for the military in World War II, and now we're most familiar with it through weather. It's rainstorms show up well on radar, but birds also show up really well on radar. And so where we have these nationwide weather radar networks, those same radar stations pick up migrating birds and can give us an idea of large-scale bird migration patterns.
So in North America, can you talk a little bit about the migration, give us a sense of what patterns get picked up by radar? For example, is it raptor? I mean, does the bird have to be large in order for the radar to hit it? Is it have to flock?
No, it doesn't have to be large birds. For weather radar, I believe it just has to be large numbers of birds. And you can't really tell on radar what species you're looking at. You just sort of see a big cloud and you know that that cloud is made up of lots and lots and lots of birds.
Okay.
But one thing that radar has helped us see is even during migration, birds aren't flying every night. They're waiting for favorable weather and things like that. And so radar is what's kind of helped us look at those patterns of when are the big migratory nights during migration season.
What are the obstacles to bird migration? And specifically, I was reading that poignant section you have about a ruby-throat hummingbird, where you describe how he's sort of flying over the Gulf of Mexico. And please elaborate on that a little bit. What happens to this hummingbird?
Yeah, so this was just a made-up scenario to show this threat. But when I write about this imaginary hummingbird, I write about it arriving over the Gulf of Mexico and seeing the lights of a bright city and flying toward them and colliding with a building. We don't know why birds that migrate at night are attracted to artificial lights, but they are. And so city lights can draw in large numbers of migrating birds at night, pull them off course, which tires them. In some cases, the birds fly into buildings. And so that's part of why they're studying what are the patterns of when the big migratory nights are, so that they can sort of put out alerts that tonight there's going to be a lot of migrants coming through and you should switch off your lights.
That's so cool. Wouldn't that be cool if as you say in the book, there's no chance that the high rises will turn off all their lights every night, but at least if we pinpoint. And what is used to pinpoint? I mean, all of the above is used to pinpoint the patterns that this will have the largest to predict.
A lot of that has specifically come out of radar work. So they've downloaded just archives of radar scans for years and years and looked for patterns in like relating the nights when there are a lot of birds showing up on radar to what's going on with the weather in the days leading up to that, so that then they can even predict a couple days in advance when one of these big migratory pushes is going to happen.
So we had an earlier episode in Israel where it's, as you know, 500 million birds migrate through Israel, and they do that twice a year. So it's 1 billion birds. And the Israeli defense aircraft used to crash into these birds, which are typically large birds. And so they have this three-pronged exercise where they used radar and they used citizen science, and our guest actually flew with the birds in a glider to find out the patterns when they come in from Egypt and fly out through Lebanon. So that was
yeah, that sounds amazing.
But he didn't use radio telemetry, so which is another thing. You have a section on radio telemetry, GPS trackers.
Yes.
How are they used for long distance migrants?
Yeah. So these are, a lot of people might have heard of the idea of putting essentially little backpacks on birds to track their movements. And there's actually several different kinds of tracking backpacks that use different types of technology and can come in different sizes. The first to be developed, as you said, was radio telemetry, which is where you put a little radio transmitter on a bird and then you can follow its movements as it moves around. The original radio transmitters only had a range of a few miles. So to track a migrating bird, you would have to follow that bird and keep up with it. And so back in the 60s and 70s, people were doing things like following radio tagged thrushes in small airplanes or in pickup trucks with radio receivers sticking out of the top, like for days across country. It was quite something.
So GPS and radio telemetry are about the same thing?
I mean, they're similar in that they're methods that are used to track birds. Radio telemetry, old-fashioned radio telemetry, sort of the original radio telemetry, is pretty simple. It's just a radio transmitter beaming out a signal that you can pick up with a receiver. GPS is more complex. It relies on a whole system of satellites in orbit, GPS satellites. This is the same thing that GPS and a car to help you navigate might rely on. And so then there's a device on the bird that's communicating with these satellites to kind of triangulate its position. And in some cases, these GPS devices are just recording the bird's position without transmitting it to anyone, and then you have to actually recapture the bird and get the device to download the data. Those are called GPS loggers, and in some cases they are actually then transmitting the data out to researchers so that you can follow the bird from anywhere in real time.
One of the fascinating things about that chapter is you talk about the philosophy of trackers, and about the bird you use is blackpoll warblers, which I've never seen. And tell us about the ethics of this as you describe it in the book.
Yeah, when I was researching and writing about these tracking backpacks, people have studied the effect that they have on birds, because it does affect the bird if you put a little backpack on it right when it's leaving to migrate to another continent. And I knew that some people might wonder about that. So I ended up finding a philosopher, an ethicist, who specifically works on bird research projects and the ethics of them, which was fascinating. So I got to talk to him and we chatted about, just is it ethically okay to be doing this? And the researchers who work with these devices and birds really care about the birds that they work with and do everything that they possibly can to minimize the harm to individual birds. They use the smallest devices possible. They won't go over a certain percentage of the bird's body weight, and they collect data to make sure that the birds seem to be returning okay. And if they find that a particular species seems to be especially sensitive to a device, they'll stop using that device with that species. You can't really get that effect or that potential for harm down to zero, but I think where the ethicists that I talked to landed on this, and where I land on this as well, is that often the data being collected can be used to inform conservation efforts that can benefit entire species. And so when you might be helping turn around a population decline, for a whole species, that outweighs a small negative impact on a few individuals.
I know from your book that you've actually done many of the things that have to do with tracking. Can you describe what was fun about writing this book, or what was hairy about writing this book?
Yeah, so I did several times get to join researchers in the field when they were actually using some of these techniques, when they were capturing or recapturing birds. And it was a lot of fun. One night I spent at night in a wetland with an ornithologist friend of mine trying to catch rails, which are small secretive wetland birds, to put a type of radio transmitter on them. And that was quite something, because the best way to catch rails is essentially just to flush them and then run after them in the wetland with a hand net and bring the net down on top of them. And so that was it was a bizarre, interesting night running through the wetland with headlamps and nets after these little birds.
From writing the book, what are some takeaways that bird watchers and people who love birds can do to help these? One obvious one I thought of was turning off the lights, but what were some of the poignant things that you learned or that changed in you because of writing the book?
Well, you asked what people can do to help birds, and there's a lot of simple things that anyone can do. A lot of people don't want to hear this, but domestic cats kill large numbers of birds every year. So if you can keep pet cats indoors, you can create more habitat in your yard or whatever land you have available, or even on a patio, just by planting the sort of native plants that benefit birds, that produce fruits and seeds that they can eat. Birds often collide with windows, and there are treatments you can buy, like little stickers and stuff, to put on your windows to make your windows safer for birds. You can reduce your uses of things like pesticides and plastic that can have harmful effects on wildlife. So yeah, there's simple actions that anyone can take to help benefit migrating birds. And
did you get a sense of the magnificence of this migration? Because anyone, I think, who does as much research on this, it's really awe-inspiring what these birds do, isn't it?
It really is. I still have not quite wrapped my head around the fact that there is a bird that makes a nonstop flight across the Pacific Ocean from Alaska to New Zealand in the fall. So birds do things that seem impossible, and it really is awe-inspiring.
Yeah. And that is it the bar-tailed godwit that you're talking about? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. And the Arctic tern also goes these large migrations. And I think you alluded to it as well in your book, and Scott talked about it, is how their routes also change. I mean, they it's not intuitive routes. It's not a straight route. Sometimes they do a figure of 8 and things like that.
Yeah, there are a lot of birds that follow a different migratory route in the spring than they do in the fall. They might adjust their route depending on what's going on with storms and the weather. Yeah, so it's not always as neat and tidy as you might think.
Yeah. And the last few questions have to do with you as a bird watcher. I always ask my guests, what are your favorite birds or species?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's really hard to pick a favorite bird, but I get asked this a lot, and my answer is always the calliope hummingbird. So this is the smallest hummingbird that we have here in North America, although there's smaller ones, I believe, in South America. These are the little birds that hover very quickly, so you can't even see their wings. And I'm very fortunate that we get calliope hummingbirds passing through our yard every spring during migration. They stop at our hummingbird feeder. They're tiny, they're beautiful. The males have these streaks of color on their throats that's very unique, so I get a big kick out of those.
Are you on the West Coast?
I live in Washington State in the US. I'm not right on the coast. I'm a 5-hour drive inland from the coast. I'm on the other side of Washington State from the Pacific Ocean, but in general, yeah, you could say I'm on the West Coast.
But the hummingbirds come through inland areas as well then?
Oh yeah, there's hummingbirds throughout North America. They're not just on the coasts.
Yeah. And why is it inspiring you? Why do you like the calliope hummingbird? Is it Calliope? Calliope?
Call, 2 L's, IOPE.
Yeah.
Oh, why do I like the calliope hummingbird so much? They're just so tiny and cute. And I grew up in a different part of the country where we didn't have nearly as many hummingbird species. And I was very excited the first time I traveled to somewhere where I could see a calliope hummingbird. And so now it's just delightful for me that I live somewhere where they come through my yard every year.
And last question is, what's next for you, Rebecca? Is it more migration books or other books? What fascinates you next?
Oh, I would love to write a second book. We'll see if I get the chance to do that. But I do a lot of other freelance writing about birds and ornithology as well. So I write for places like the Audubon magazine and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology magazine. And I'm going to be continuing to do that. And I just feel really lucky that I get to write about birds and ornithology as my job. It's really cool.
So thank you so much for being a guest with the Bird Podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening.